A very good morning to each one of you. On behalf of Bangalore Chamber of Industry and Commerce, we welcome you all for the second in the series of the session, Decarbonization Across Value Chain for Achieving Net Zero, organized under the aegis of the Chamber's ESG Expert Committee. Thank you very much, Mr. Joseph Martin, for accepting our invitation to address this session. The session is the ESG Expert Committee is chaired by Mr. VC Mohan, who is the Senior General Manager, EHS Management India of Bosch Limited, co-chaired by Mr. Rajesh Jha, Country Environment and Sustainability Manager, ABB India Limited. Just a brief about Mr. Joseph Martin. He is the markets leader of ESG platform of PwC India. He has close to 4 decades of industrial, IT, business consulting and climate change and sustainability experience in India, Middle East and North Africa. He is a BTech and MBA from Premium Institutes in India. Thank you once again, Mr. Joseph Martin, and we welcome you for the session. The Chamber acknowledges the support of its annual sponsors, Mrs. Bueller, Continental, Fundermax, IIMPL, MTR, Ramaya Institute of Management, SD, MIMD, Sona Group, TVS Motor, and Vishwas Group for their immense support in the activities of the Chamber. Now I would hand over the platform to Mr. VC Mohan, Chair of the ESG Expert Committee. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Rupa. Thanks for introducing the topic for today's webinar. Mr. Joseph, thank you very much for accepting our invite, and Rajesh, thanks for coordinating Josephine. So when I hear from your profile that you have over 4 decades of experience, that speaks about your rich experience and what we can look forward today. And the topic is also quite challenging, decarbonization across the value chain. Being in Bosch for last 24 years, I know, I was part of the sustainability journey in Bosch, and I know how challenging it is to realize net zero. If you look at Bosch itself, from our production plants, our footprint is about 1% scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and 99% is scope 3 emissions, out of which 9% is from the value chain, upstream, downstream, and 90% coming from our products. So it is going to be a challenge, and the other side, the light at the end of the tunnel is the technology is evolving. There are alternative technologies available, and the industries, at least a major portion of the industries, are also taking it as part of their business strategy. So this is where we have brighter spot, and we are working together. And when we look at the literature which is available, it speaks about some good amount of achievement so far in the direction of net zero. So, Mr. Joseph, we look forward for your presentation, and I request all the participants to interact freely, understand, and let us make it a very interesting dialogue. Rajesh, you want to add some comments?
Right. So good morning everyone, and thank you, Mohanji, for your opening remarks. And of course, I must appreciate this particular session today, because we all know that net zero is our target. In fact, even in country also, we all are having a clear target of 2070 to become a net zero country, in fact, right? And I think every business, or every, in fact, the kind of industries also, they are looking at having certain clear target on net zero. Now people are actually coming out from the word called carbon neutral. Now slowly it's moving towards the net zero world, because everybody is aware, like as Mohanji mentioned, the scope 1 and 2 is a very small amount that actually, when you compare with the entire value chain, right? When upstream and downstream, we have a huge emission that has to be taken care. And I think though we have a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. In fact, when we say we have a huge opportunity in terms of not only reducing the emission, but also somewhere we can also see it can also enhance the overall competitiveness of the organization, right? So we all have seen it in our own organizations. It's not about just renewable power we have procured to reduce the carbon, but we have also seen somewhere it has impacted our, the cost also, which has really given a good benefits in some of the areas. So I think it goes hand in hand, like, the progress as well as decarbonization. And I think this particular topic, what we have decided to have today in our, of course, this particular, the webinar, that there is a series of webinar, like the first webinar we had on overall the ESG perspective, what we have been doing. And of course, the Bosch from Mohanji's side only, we had a presentation. And of course, this is second series where, of course, we'll be talking about the decarbonization. And I think we have, of course, as you mentioned, none other than a good speaker, the renowned speaker, Mr. Joseph, who would be taking us through the entire journey. And of course, some of the strategies which are also important to decarbonize. And of course, in Indian perspective, we have to look at the net zero, how to achieve it, in fact, and of course, how to support the entire system so that we can run together and of course achieve our targets. So I think with this, I'll just hand over to our speaker, great speaker, to of course take us through the entire session. And of course, the entire Q&A we'll have at the end of the session. And parallelly, you can also put it in the chat box. Whoever has any comments or any kind of suggestions or any Q&A, you can put it in the chat box. We'll take up at the end of the session. Yeah, so over to you, Joseph ji. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohan ji, Rajesh ji, and Rupa ji, for inviting me for the session. And my sincere thanks to the entire BCIC to invite us for this session. I had the opportunity to speak on one of the event, but now again within a year, I'm very glad to come back and speak on this particular important topic here. I will use a deck to convey the messages which I am trying to bring here. So is it possible? Is it visible to all of you?
Yes, please. Yes.
Okay. So today I will look at the three topics here. One is the decarbonization. Second is how it is affecting the value chain, and how decarbonization of the value chain can help us achieve the net zero target. So those three concepts, I think we need to be very clear during today's discussion, which I'll try to explain here. Before I get into the net zero discussion, I think most of the people we all think why we should go for this net zero. Is it only an environmental issue that we are trying to achieve, or is it only because of there is a resource constraint on the planet? When I say resource constraint, Earth has a specific limit in terms of how much it can provide in terms of natural resources and how much it can absorb as a pollution or a carbon emission that is coming. So that limit we are fast achieving. There are a lot of studies saying that many of the limits we already crossed. And what happens now when the limit crosses is it affects the economy, it affects the society, and it affects the personal life of each of us. So if you look at the impact on resource constrained planet, right, last 50 years, there were a lot of effort from the global platforms, global governments, multilateral organizations to mitigate whatever we are doing the impact on the planet. And according to the understanding about the impact on the planet and how it will affect the economy as well as the society, the expectations of stakeholders have changed over a period of time. You might have seen regulators are coming very strongly now, asking for disclosures. Customers are asking, many of the B2B customers, even B2C customers, the consumers itself are looking for performance of their products from a carbon perspective. Investors are looking at it from very, very close angle, because unless you mitigate this, investment will be at risk in the long run. And of course, community, NGOs, and all the activism that is coming, which is emerging. Because of this emerging requirements of various stakeholders, corporates have come out with disclosures. They are measuring the baseline. They are creating certain roadmap of achieving the net zero, and they are coming out with a lot of data into the public domain. So if you look at India, the BRSR regulation, about 1,000 companies have put their BRSR indicators into the public domain. Anybody can actually download that from the BSE, NSE websites, and then you can do the analysis. So significant amount of data that is coming into the public domain. What is happening is this data is actually helping the fund flows, especially from the institutional investors, private equities, and the developmental financial institutions, and the banks and insurance providers. Everyone is using this data to make sure that fund is actually allocated for some of this decarbonization activities. So this entire cycle, when you actually get into more fund allocation towards decarbonization activities, it is expected that the impact on the resource constrained planet will be reduced. So this is a kind of cycle we need to understand that there is a huge impact on the planet based on what we are doing in our economy. There is an increased stakeholder activism or shareholder activism that is coming out towards reducing this impact. To address that shareholder activism, significant amount of data is coming into the public domain. That data is actually driving significant amount of cash flow, fund flow towards the decarbonization. This is one important point I think we need to keep in mind. Just to give you an idea about what are the kind of numbers we are talking about. If you read World Meteorological Organization's report in 2020, India had an average of $87 billion of impact, negative impact every year during the last decade. So it's only one country getting impacted $87 billion. 700 regulations globally has come, which is only related to sustainable finance in various parts of the world. About $5 billion worth of data that has come into the public domain during the last couple of years. And because of this, about US $121 trillion are being flown into, which is about 1/3 of the global fund flow is actually getting oriented towards sustainability. And in various forms, some of those funds are looking at screening of the investments from a sustainability angle. Some of the investments are purely for some of the sustainability related activities like decarbonization. Some of them are giving, depending on the performance on sustainability, that funds coupon rates will be affected. So there are different kinds of funds are also coming, which amounts to about 121 trillion. So this is a background I would like to give you. But coming back to, okay, this is the macro view, which I told. There is a economic reason, there is a societal reason, there is an investment reason, there is a regulator pressure. These are all coming globally. But I think more importantly, if you look at how the decarbonization journey happened over a period of time, from 2000 to 2022, the carbon intensity, the global carbon intensity, which means for creating every rupee of GDP, how much carbon you use, that has come down by 1.4% from 2000 to 2022. And in 2022, I think probably you all would know that 2022 and 23 were significant years, where there is a lot of ramp up happened towards net zero. That ramp up, whatever you have seen today, has helped to increase the carbon intensity reduction from 1.4 to 2.5. This is what we have achieved till now. Whatever we are talking today about these regulations and commitments and our decarbonization strategies, this is what we have achieved. But if you look at the Paris Agreement target Paris Agreement talks about two targets. One is you bring down the carbon emissions so that your temperature increase, post-industrial temperature increase to 2 degrees centigrade, or try to achieve 1.5 degree. So if you want to achieve the 1.5 degree, then every year the carbon intensity has to reduce by 17.2. If you want to achieve 2 degree, then it has to be reduced by 6.5, which will give you a clear indication on whatever we have achieved till now is not at all enough, and a huge task is in face in the future. And when you look at this huge task, why people should do it? Because if you look at the rate of decarbonization, if the decarbonization is not happening at the rate what we are expecting, like 17.5, it will actually increase the temperature of the Earth. And every small increase in the temperature of the Earth will actually affect the physical risk. Physical risk means the extreme weather events that is happening, the temperature rise that is happening, and the sea level rise that is happening, which will have a negative impact on the economy. But if, for example, if you are achieving that 1.5 degree, a huge transition in the economy to lower energy intensity, then there will be significant changes in the market. There will be regulations coming, technologies getting developed, and companies will be leveraging. Some of the companies who have taken strategic view about this net zero will be taking advantage, competitive advantage, so that they will become much more profitable, much more competitive in the market. So there will be a fast disruption in the market if somebody is going to adopt that. So the key point here is, if companies want to take it as a key strategic imperative, then companies should be able to calibrate their actions how this net zero is evolving in the market. There is a possibility that carbon reduction may not happen. There is a possibility that carbon reduction may be happening in a fast emerging scenario. In both the scenarios, we should be prepared to run our business profitably. That's the challenge that is coming to all the corporates. And when you look at that challenge, and when you look at how it has evolved over a period of time, I'm just giving you an idea about what kind of regulations have come across the globe. So we know that European Union had been in the forefront. There was a European Green Deal that came. There is a green taxonomy that has been defined. And there is a regulation known as SFDR, Sustainable Financial Disclosure Requirements, which basically aims at whenever an investment company invests anywhere, they need to come out with a proper monitoring and reporting mechanism on how they have deployed their funds. That is known as the SFDR. The CSRD and ESRS standard that came is talking about much more detail, about 1,000 data points reporting from the large corporates in European Union. Again, some of the companies who are operating in European Union also needs to be complying with that. Who has certain threshold of business, certain number of people who are actually present in European Union, certain amount of assets, value of assets that is in the European Union, they have to report on that. So that is the regulation that came in European Union in the last 3 to 5 years. UK is also following on that. USA and Canada, though they were giving significant incentives, for example, in USA for the last 10 years, carbon sequestration, that is capturing of the carbon and then burying the carbon under the earth, was given significant incentives from a tax incentive perspective, like 45Q, which got enhanced to almost $80 per ton of carbon during the Inflation Reduction Act. So even though USA has not come out with penalization disclosure requirements till now mandatory, some of the states have, but overall, there is a drive towards decarbonization in US. If you look at India, I think we have talked about, we know all that BRSR regulations came in. Then last year, SEBI came out with BRSR Core, which includes carbon emissions and energy intensity. And also, SEBI is asking for reasonable assurance of the BRSR Core, which means whatever is disclosed in the public domain will be scrutinized as it is scrutinizing the financial reporting metrics. So the kind of rigorous audit that is coming on financial metrics will be also applicable to the BRSR Core indicators. On top of that, RBI last year came out with a report. RBI is recommending that all the regulated entities has to get into TCFD reporting, which is basically identifying what kind of physical as well as transition risk the business are going to face and report on how to mitigate that risk. That is the TCFD reporting. If you look at any other place, everywhere in the last 3 to 5 years, the countries have come out with some kind of regulation or some kind of incentives so that people can actually come out with net zero commitments and then invest and improve the decarbonization rate over a period of time, leveraging various kinds of mechanisms globally. It differs between geography to geography, but the general trend is that the regulations and disclosure requirements and incentives are ramping up over a period of time. And it is expected to ramp up in the near future also. Now, most of you're all coming from different kinds of entities. Some of you are representing listed entities. Some of you will be coming from private entities, which is not listed in the capital market. Some of you will be representing the global competency centers, which are large centers in India, which is supporting the global corporates. And many of you might be, interested in startups and IPOs and those. So people normally ask, should I look at net zero only if I a listed entity? The answer is, for all the different kinds of entities which I listed here, a very clear driver is there. Now, we all know that listed entities has a clear requirement because there is a disclosure requirements. Their valuation is connected with how they are performing on ESG. That is very well known. But if you look at the non-listed entities, many of the non-listed entities which I had conversed with, though they are not listing, they have certain other requirements. For example, they are selling their products in other parts of the world. And all the different parts of the world, especially in US and Europe, the need for coming out with carbon intensity measurement of the products, that is becoming a mandatory requirement now. You might have heard about carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is coming up in Europe very soon. By 2027, the products that are getting imported, certain kinds of product like steel or cement or petrochemicals, will be taxed based on the amount of carbon intensity of their entire product. So the carbon intensity of the product also, I think that is related to the topic today, that carbon intensity will not lie only on the carbon that is embedded during the production of that product. That carbon intensity will depend on how you are sourcing the material from the source, what kind of raw materials you are taking, how we are transporting that raw material, how we are producing the product, and how we are dispatching this product, and how the products are used. When the products are used, the carbon intensity or carbon emissions are also going up. So you need to look at the entire carbon emission of the value chain when you come into some of this carbon measurement. So non-listed entities also require some kind of carbon measurement because the customers are asking for it, or if they are going for some kind of investments funding, then the funders or investors will be really asking for it. Coming to inbounds and GCCs, we have in India about 1,900 GCCs, and 50% of the GCCs are in Bangalore. And all these GCCs are supporting their global business, and all the global business entities have a net zero target. And it is not that they have a net zero target alone. They have to measure the carbon emissions. They have to report the carbon emissions. They have to monitor how the carbon emissions are getting reduced using certain kind of technology implementation or efficiency implementation or change in the business models. So that requires significant amount of data management capability. One example, I think we have seen many companies globally. They have looked at the creating pools of carbon data. How the carbon emissions are evolving across their own businesses, right from their supply chain in the manufacturing facility and to the customer side, and they are coming out to that kind of carbon data pools so that they can create more competitive advantage in terms of what is my current carbon exposure, how the carbon exposure is going to grow when my business is going to grow, and how I have to reduce that carbon emission so that I can meet the requirements. So those global corporates definitely have a reason to invest in GCCs because India as a country has the required talent, the technical talent, and that is the reason why we brought in GCCs into the country. Second is because of the rigorous regulatory pressure in India, the awareness about these regulations and talent related to the regulations are available in India. So the GCCs have a clear reason for investing in India, for bringing out carbon measurement and carbon tracking systems apart from participating their global strategy of carbon reduction. So there are two angles now which I am trying to bring here in inbound and GCCs. Startups and IPOs, any IPO, the entity is actually getting into the capital market, and capital market globally everywhere, they will also look for some kind of disclosures on carbon or ESG. So there is a clear driver for startups to prepare for getting into carbon emissions. The second reason is there is conclusive proof that valuation of startups will have a certain element of ESG performance into it. So creating a structure internally for measurement of the carbon, creating a plan for decarbonization of the business, and then disclosing it during the IPOs will be really valuable for startups. Now, from our perspective, I have already told about world needs to act with urgency. Only world has about 7 years. This is actually prepared in 21. So only 7 years to halve the global greenhouse gas emissions. India's target is also reduce the carbon intensity by 45% by 2030. The current pace of change is far behind the pace. I already talked about that. And companies have to play a pivotal role. We cannot expect government to come out with certain measures, but companies have a pivotal role. The more important thing is there is significant benefit that is coming. Capital markets are requiring disclosures. Customers are requiring suppliers to act. War for talent, because companies aligning to net zero will require some kind of talent to manage that. So that is also going up. Governments are aggressively focusing on net zero. So if you look at the companies who've taken bold steps, they have not waited for the regulations to emerge. They have found that this is a strategically important imperative for them, and they have taken prepared actions. It is not that people get into huge investments, except for energy companies like large energy companies who have taken huge investments in the country as well as globally. They are changing their business model so that they will be able to supply the kind of energy that is required by their customers. Not only the fossil fuel energy companies, the power and utilities companies, they are all gearing up, looking at the new energy systems, which will involve not only the fossil fuel, it will involve significant amount of renewable energy. Then we are talking about technologies like hydrogen and batteries, where you can actually bring in a lot of order towards the intermittent supply of energy that is coming from renewable sources, and then taking the carbon sequestration kind of technologies, the CCS technologies, where any residual carbon that is available can be captured and then buried under the ground permanently, so that you can remove carbon from the atmosphere. So the entire scope of work which we are talking about doesn't limit only to the carbon measurement and technologies. It will have a much more wider business transformation angle, because businesses have to remodel itself so that their inherent carbon intensity can be reduced by changing the business model. Then second thing is, if they have to collaborate with other companies, without collaboration, you may not be able to achieve some of these targets, because the target is huge. We have achieved only 2.5 till now, and the ask is 17.5, which is significantly high kind of target. So by acting alone, you will not be able to achieve it. There needs to be collaboration across the supply chain and the customer side, so that the joint effort and joint benefit and joint power, joint investments can actually reduce the risk of the investments. And at the same time, you can actually share and get the benefit of the investments, not only for the company's future, but for the planet's future. Now I'll come to some of the fundamentals here. I think everyone will ask, how do I measure carbon? And this is a simplified diagram from the GHG protocol. I think most of you have heard about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, but just want to reiterate, scope 1 and scope 2, which will be very much under the control of the organization. Scope 1 is the carbon emissions that are, coming from either heat or energy produced within the boundary of the organization. So if you are burning some fuel, if you are running a power plant within your premises, all the energy that is burned to create electricity as well as heat or even to cool, that is actually a summation of for scope 1. So any energy source within the organization, within the perimeter, You have to measure how much energy is actually produced and what is the kind of energy source that you used and what will be the carbon emission for per ton of that energy source, and then calculate the energy emissions in this scope 1. Scope 2 is basically coming out from if you are buying electricity from outside or if you are buying heat from outside. So the actual emission happen outside the perimeter of the organization, but the energy or heat or cooling is actually happening within the perimeter. That is known as scope 2. But I think these two we clearly understand because it's a very very much close to our own premises. Scope 3 is a much more widely defined, and it is right from the supply side to the customer side. You have to look at what are the other carbon emissions which are coming out by virtue of your own activity. Like for example, you purchase goods and services. A petroleum refinery buys crude from internationally, or any electronic equipment manufacturer will buy steel or plastic from an external source. Whatever emissions that is embedded in that particular product that is coming under purchase goods and services. You buy significant amount of capital goods to buy to set up your plants or your facilities. That is coming under capital goods. Fuel and energy related emissions not calculated within scope 1 and scope 2. So there can be some fuel or energy emissions that is coming in the supply side or customer side, which you have to calculate. Transportation and distribution. When you bring products or when you bring capital goods, then the transportation and distribution, the carbon emission related to that. Waste generated in operations of those entities which are coming out as carbon emissions, then upstream leased assets. If you are leasing some assets, that may not be in your premises, in your perimeter, but that will become a scope 3. Within your organization, the business travel people are doing, the employee computing that is happening, the franchisees you are setting up, the investments you are providing, this also will come under scope 3. Similarly, at the customer side, use of sold products, processing of sold products, end of life treatment. So many of the products will have a carbon emission at the end of their life. You need to calculate that. Then downstream leased assets and downstream transportation. So together, this will become your carbon inventory, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Now, I think I'm giving a brief of the different kinds of standards that are used. I think most of us are maybe aware of the basic standards. You have the GHG protocol. There is a corporate GHG protocol. How do you measure carbon emissions from various sources within the corporate? There is a product lifecycle accounting and reporting standard. So you look at any product, you take a car, you take a bike, or you take a computer, or you take any of the food items which you're consuming, right from the supply side to the manufacturing and to the usage side. How do you account the product life cycle? Corporate value chain, that's the scope 3 accounting, there is a specific standard. And there is a standard for project activities. So if you're doing a project and if you have certain restriction in terms of how much carbon emission you can emit during the project life cycle, then you can use that. So those are the 4 basic standards I have mentioned. The finance related standards that came during the last couple of years, which is one is the financed emissions. So if a bank is providing financing to its entities, how that financing will affect in emissions. So there is a standard to calculate that emissions. Facilitated emissions. Most of the investment banks or large financial institutions, they facilitate transactions. For example, equity transactions or debt transactions or blended finance. So in whatever facilitation they are doing, how are you taking care of the carbon emissions of those financing? There is a standard for that. Insurance associated emissions. So if you are assuring or providing some insurance to some of the assets, what is that assets insurance related emissions? That is also there is a standard. Then if you look at communities and cities, there are some standards like mitigation goal standard, community scale, like city you want to measure the carbon emissions, that's a standard, and a policy and action standard. If a country or a state or a district or a municipal corporation wants to come out with a policy and action related to climate change and carbon emission, there is a standard for that. So it's a broad scope of standards in terms of only carbon emission measurement. Now I'll give you a bit of, I think, both Mohan ji and Rajesh ji mentioned about this, during their initial talk. The scope 3 emissions, it will always be, much more than the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. But even in that, depending on the sector, the mix of that, scope 3 emissions, like for example, utility scope 3 emissions is 59% of the total emissions. Basic materials, it will be 64%. But if you come to consumer discretionary, 94% is actually scope 3 emissions. But within that scope 3 emissions also, you can see that between the different sectors, the percentage of upstream as well as downstream also changes. So this is published in a very recent report from London Stock Exchange Group. It's a global study they have done, and they brought out a kind of average kind of various sectors. How much is the scope 3 emission that can be the total? And within that scope 3 emissions, how much will be the upstream and downstream? And there are two major findings that is coming from that report. One is there is a variability of the scope 3 emissions. So you measure the scope 3 emissions today. It may not be exactly the same as if you are, even if you are not changing your business or anything next year, because there are a lot of other parameters are changing. So there is a variability to whatever scope 3 emission you are measuring. The second is there is a lot of uncertainty in scope 3 emission measurement, because most of the measurement are not coming from first principles. You use some proxies to measure, and because of you are using proxies and the approximation of the proxies, there is a lot of variability in scope 3 emissions. So when you look at the scope 3 emissions of your own assets, you should keep this in mind. There can be a variability as well as there can be an uncertainty in terms of scope 3 emission measurement. Now, we all talked about the investment angle towards climate change. And I'm just giving a snapshot of MSCI climate risk indicators. How MSCI is measuring the climate risk of an entity. There are two aspects MSCI is actually talking about. One is the climate impact of the company. Climate impact of the company can be measured by how much is the carbon emission the company is actually emitting today, and how much that carbon emission is going to be in the future. Like, it is because the company is going to grow, the company's business is going to maybe change, the energy mix is going to change. So because of all these impacts, how the carbon emissions of company is going to grow. That is one aspect. This is measured using certain specific indicators. So if you look at scope 1 and 2 and 3 carbon intensity, that is one of the indicator they have told about the current carbon footprint. If you want to measure what is the future impact of the company, then something known as implied temperature rise. Implied temperature rise means based on what is the contribution of the company towards the global warming, depending on how much is the carbon emission that company is coming out with, what is the size of the business, and what is the kind of carbon emission intensity of that particular business, what can be the implied temperature rise. So you might say that your company's implied temperature rise is 2.5 degree because your current carbon emissions and your future projections are basically leading to any climate scientist to believe that your business will actually run into implied temperature rise of 2.4 degree. So that will become an important indicator for you. What is the implied temperature rise for your business in the future? That is the climate impact of the company. So how company is going to contribute to the problem of climate. The second angle is what is the company's exposure from a climate change? What is the company's climate risk exposure? One can be carbon emissions revenue intensity today. So if you're running your business and if your carbon intensity of getting every rupee of revenue is high, then you have a high risk of climate, because whenever there is a regulation coming, your measurement will be impacting a huge risk on your portfolio, and it will have an additional cost. So if somebody is imposing a tax on your carbon intensity based on your product, it will have a cost implication for you, or it will have an access to market implication also. So if somebody is telling your product can be sold only if your carbon intensity is less than a certain limit. So, and if your carbon intensity is on the higher side, then you run into a risk of non-access to the market. So that is one angle of the climate risk. The other angle is how the future scenario is changing. So if you look at the physical risk and transition risk, which I told in the initial slide, depending on how the carbon emission reduction is going to happen, and depending on how the regulations are going to pan out very quickly, then you run into a future scenario risk. So that also has to be calculated. I have not gone into the details of that calculation. There is a significant modeling effort that is required, a lot of analytical effort that is required. But these kind of indicators needs to be calculated if you want to come out with a TCFD reporting, which is basically telling what is the climate risk of your company, how you are contributing to the climate problem, and how you are getting impacted by the climate problem from a business perspective, and what should be the preparedness for your organization in the future. This is how the measurement systems are now evolving. And if you look at this MSCI climate indicators, this came out very recently. MSCI never used to do these kind of climate risk indicators, but it has come now, and they are evaluating companies based on this, which will be used by the potential investors, potential regulators for assessing the climate risk of each of your business. And when it comes to the question is now, okay, we talked about all this risk as well as now you talked about how you measure it. But if you look at how to reduce that, climate, the decarbonization and achieve the net zero, this is a standard recommended systematic approach. Now, on the left side, you can see you will baseline your emissions. You will look at your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and then you baseline it. Then you try to see what are the levers that are available for you. Levers can be energy efficiency. I think most of you might have looked at energy efficiency from various angles, whether it is a manufacturing plant, whether it's a building, or whether it's a logistical entity. You have looked at energy efficiency possibilities. We have all looked at what kind of capital investment we can do to improve the energy efficiency. Second lever is you have a certain mix of fossil fuel in your energy system. How can you incorporate renewable energy into it? And there are multiple angles to this renewable energy. One is renewable energy. Sometimes it can be costly, but in most of the times you have enough market mechanisms and regulatory mechanisms in the country so that you can improve your renewable energy mix without increasing your cost. In fact, you can reduce the cost. In many of the client engagements we have done, we have helped the client to increase the renewable energy efficiency, but at the same time, in renewable energy mix in the energy, at the same time, you reduce the cost of the power. So that is one lever you have. Water conservation. In many large organizations, you use a lot of water. Water conserved is actually energy conserved. It can come from scope 1 or scope 2 perspective, or it can even come from scope 3 perspective. Whatever water intensity reduction you are trying to make, it will actually contribute to your energy intensity. Then you can look at advanced technologies. Advanced technologies like you can look at biofuel. Now we have seen significant change in the mix of a biofuel that is coming into the energy mix. You can use biomass. You can use bioenergy, biofuels that is coming from methanol or biofuel that is mixed into the transportation system. So there are possibilities of shifting your energy source. In addition to that, if you are bringing renewable energy, if you are using storage systems like battery systems, then you can increase your renewable energy mix without affecting the continuous supply of energy for your use. Because you know that renewable energy is coming as a very intermittent kind of energy, either wind or solar. But if you use a battery system, then you can stabilize that input of energy, and that is again another technology that is coming. Then you can look at technologies like hydrogen, which is coming up in the near future. At this point of time, it is not a feasible option, but there are many levers that you can use to improve use hydrogen into your energy mix, especially for hard to abate sectors. Like where battery storage may not be a good solution for pumping in a lot of energy. If you are having a heater or if you're having a chemical engineering equipment which requires a lot of energy, then advanced technologies like hydrogen will be useful. Material circularity is another aspect. If you improve the circular economy of your business, then you can actually improve the energy intensity. So these are, some of the levers you have, from decarbonization perspective. Then you can have strategies also, like, you can look at, the internal carbon pricing and internal, water pricing. You can look at what kind of pricing you can actually bring in there. Then you can raising finance. You can raise some of the sustainable finance so that you can reduce the cost of capital. I explained to you different kinds of financing instruments are coming depending on what is your capital investment and what kind of deployment you are trying to bring in. You can use different kinds of financing. Every financing institution, including banks and financial institutions, coming out with certain products. So if you show your sustainability, net zero, carbon emissions, performance, and your intent to invest in it, you can get into a structuring of some of these products so that you can get a lower cost of capital for your products, which will actually accelerate your deployment of carbon emissions. So this is the overall systematic approach to net zero. But this is actually talking mostly from a scope 1 and scope 2. And I'll come to the next slide where we will explain what can be a potential comprehensive approach towards net zero transformation. So if you look at scope 1 and scope 2, whatever I talked earlier will be a good approach for you. And most of the companies are taking that approach at this point of time, because that is the low-hanging fruit. That is the immediate requirement of addressing how I can reduce my scope 1 and scope 2 using certain kind of levers which I can invest. Most of the times, that investment will give you positive returns. So it'll be easy for you to get the capital approval. But when you get into the next stage, once you achieve whatever you could achieve with the internal levers, the target and the requirement from the market is significantly getting into the entire value chain approach. To give you an example, if you look at BRSR, value chain reporting requirement, BRSR is telling you need to assess the environmental impact across your value chain, and you have to report that risk and opportunities in the entire value chain from an environmental perspective. That is one disclosure they are asking. The second disclosure, which will require some kind of limited assurance also, look at your supply side and look at how much is the spend on the supply side. And what BRSR is talking about is a threshold limit of 75%. So look at the suppliers side and then look at the 9 indicators. Come out with disclosures on these 9 indicators for suppliers who are covering 75% of your spend. And look at the customer side, 75% of the revenue you are gaining, you have to report on the 9 BRSR core indicators. And moreover, you have to come out with a limited assurance on these 9 indicators. If you look at this point of time, it's a great challenge. It's a huge challenge for the organization because first of all, your number of suppliers will be huge. Your number of customers will be huge. Certain organizations will have the advantage, their 75% of the suppliers will be a small number. But depending on the business model, depending on the type of manufacturing you are doing, for example, if you get into a food and agri kind of business, the number of suppliers is numerous and number of customers are also numerous. How do you calculate? How do you bring these data? There are different ways of addressing it. There are short-term strategies and there are long-term strategies. So short-term strategies are maybe you will go and depend on some of the rating systems so that you can take the data from the rating system and then use that for some of the disclosures. But in long term, the objective of the government, objective of the regulators, and more importantly, the opportunity for the organizations. If this net zero requirements, ESG requirements are coming out intensively, your ability to command the performance of your ESG performance of your supplier side and the customer side, and the data related to your suppliers and your customers, ESG performance data, will become a very high competitive advantage for you. Because if you have that kind of a data within your hand, you will be able to know what is the life cycle emissions you are going to see and what is the exposure you are getting at it. It will be helping you to even strategize your new corporate strategic plans also. So from a strategic imperative perspective, the data availability in terms of the value chain will be significantly high. The second part is how do you collect this data? You may not be able to collect this data unless you engage with your suppliers. You should have direct connect with the suppliers. You should have digital systems for collecting this data and then using that data to come out with this reporting. So you can look at it from a compliance perspective of meeting BRSR requirement. And at the same time, you can look at the entire landscape that is evolving and look at it from a long-term strategic imperative. So if you are to take that strategic approach of a transformational approach, these are the 9 elements you need to consider. And these 9 elements had been identified by our studies and some of the studies. And these 9 elements I will explain in the next 5 to 10 minutes, and then I will get into more questions. One is the ambition setting. Ambition setting, I think most of the corporates have started doing it, because irrespective of whether they can achieve net zero or not, looking at some of the standards, like look at India's 2070 target or India's short-term target of by 45% of carbon intensity reduction by 2030. Look at those kind of guidances and see where you want to position your ambition. Or you can get into standards like SBTI, Science-Based Target Initiative, where there are models, there are kind of measurement systems, target setting approaches, which will help you to achieve what are the possible targets you can achieve and what is expected out of you, depending on which sector you are coming in. That is looking at the ambition setting part of it. Second is the corporate strategy. Typically in all the organizations which I am working in, many of the organizations, they started feeling it. Like, it is not a separate strategy which environmental or social governance team can actually handle, or maybe a reporting team can handle. It has to be embedded in the corporate strategy of allocating the portfolio, looking at the corporate strategy, what are the kind of products you are going to make and sell, in what kind of production systems you are going to invest, and what is the product mix you are coming out with, how carbon is going to affect that product mix will become an essential element of your corporate strategy. So embedding that into your corporate strategy, looking at what is your current product portfolio, what is the baseline emission that is coming out of it, what is the growth plan you have created, which all geographies you are going to sell this particular product, and what is the carbon emission that is going to happen in that projected scenario, and then look at how to manage your corporate strategy in such a way that you can achieve net zero target when the regulations are actually coming. When you define the corporate strategy, then the governance will become an important thing. Oversight of governance, accountability, the process, capacity, these are all become very important for you. If you look at some of the disclosures that are coming now with respect to governance, we normally think, if you create a committee and if you allocate responsibilities for some of the specific indicators to functional departments, and if you report on a half-yearly basis or yearly basis, that is enough. But leading organizations have started disclosing who among the corporate board is actually taking care of certain topics. What is the capability of that person? What is the experience of that person in terms of, for example, if you look at biodiversity as a topic or carbon emissions as a topic? What is the technical competence of the independent board members are also becoming under scrutiny at a global level. I think soon it will come to India also, because taking decisions and calibrating the corporate strategy with respect to net zero ambitions and net zero trajectory, you need to have significant competence and experience at the board level and the management level. So improving the capacity, capability, and competence of the management and the board, and then coming out with very detailed decision-making systems so that you can drive your net zero is also becoming extremely important from an investor perspective. Then if you look at ESG and net zero, it touches every function in the organization. It's not only centered around only reporting or data collection. It will touch your supply chain. It will touch your marketing function. It will touch your HR function. So every function will be affected by net zero. So how do you look at this net zero as a transformation requirements and then make some twist and tweak to your business processes? Make sure that people understand what is the role they have to play in the new paradigm. That becomes a reason for enterprise transformation. Supply chain automation, supply chain optimization and supply chain digitization is in the agenda of all the people. But if you look at now supply chain, you look at only the cost, the quality of the supply chain and the reliability of the entire supply chain. But increasingly, this cost, quality and reliability will be affected by climate change and net zero. So looking at supply chain from a net zero, embedding net zero requirements into your entire supply chain management system will become very important. Innovation. And I'm talking about circular economy and new business models. If you bring in the kind of technology and if you change the business model itself, then you will be able to achieve some of the carbon emission reduction. And for that, you need to have some collaboration across the boundaries, collaboration with some of the suppliers across the sectors, like maybe oil and gas sector will be collaborating with renewable energy sector, or oil and gas sector will be collaborating with battery systems, or even textile sector will be collaborating with biofuels, or even sugar sector is actually collaborating with the oil and gas energy sector. So there are multiple collaboration possibilities are coming. So innovation is an important area there. Finance I have already talked about, but having financial opportunities outside the organization will not be enough. Ramping up, changing the finance function, and then helping the finance function to understand the opportunities outside and changing the financing model of the organization also will become very important. Transparency, we all know, because transparency is what is driving all these things. Reporting and coming out in the public domain with respect to transparency is an essential requirement. One important point here is when you come out with these disclosures and external disclosures, the integrity of the data and the confidence in which you can actually come out with some of the data in the public domain, that will depend on your internal strategy, internal governance systems, the digital systems you are having, the capability of the people who are actually managing that data disclosures. Everything will come in place when you are talking about the integrity of the data that is coming to the public domain. So transparency is an important element. Then the last element, which is the engagement and advocacy. Because this topic, net zero topic is having wider ramification across the sectors and across societies and communities. Unless you engage with the decision makers, regulators. When I say engage, it is not that you unduly influence the advocacy and the regulatory authority, but continuously engaging with the regulatory authority, creating your expectations, and then putting out your expectations in the right turners will help the regulators also shape the policies according to the requirements of the market. So continuous engagement and advocacy with the decision makers as well as various industrial bodies. And I believe the BCIC's interest in terms of running this program is also towards that. How can you come out with sector specific or region specific requirements, come out in the public and talk about what are the requirements, what are the challenges, what are the expectations as a business provider in terms of that particular geography or sector. This is also extremely important. So these are the key elements which I would like to talk about. I would like to stop here and then look for questions, because I think I've taken almost 50 minutes which was allocated. But I would think that more sharing of experience, and it need not be questions to me also. If I have missed out certain important points, or if you have a valid point to make, please feel free to do that. Open for discussion, and handing over to you, Rajesh, for moderation.
Right. So just a minute. Yeah. So thank you, Mr. Joshua, in fact, for taking us through the entire presentation. Quite insightful, in fact. And of course, I think we have some questions also in the entire chat box. Also, we have, I think, one question. Parallelly, I'll also be taking up some of the question from my end, because I also represent a company where we also have started certain activities in value chain. And we also see certain challenges, certain, kind of even the doubts, you can say, when it comes to covering the net zero in a more holistic way, right? So I think before going to the queries, of course, I must again say thanks because you have covered almost all the dimensions. You started from the regulation part, the standards, the different approach. In fact, must appreciate. In fact, you also mentioned that the kind of approach we should adopt to have this the carbon decarbonization activity or the net zero related activities. And of course, you also mentioned a very quite insightful idea about the overall blocks, the 9 key blocks, right? Where, of course, you mentioned individually how it's quite important for an organization to take it forward actually in a more better manner. I think one question I'll take it from the chat box. So we have a query with respect to the BRSR core. I think it's quite common that we have now some of the listed entities, they need to, of course, fulfill the BRSR core requirement, where there's a requirement called 75% of the purchase volume. Whether it will be considering only the direct material or even indirect material can be considered. That's the first question. And of course, second, with respect to BRSR core only, whether the foreign suppliers are part of this particular 75%. You can say the kind of the criteria what the government has put actually. So these two queries we have got from Mr. Nagesh Kumar. So we need your input on that.
Sure, Rajesh. I think it's a valid question, and which is the common challenge which everyone is facing at this point of time. So if you look at the BRSR regulation, it is not very specifically telling whether we should include indirect material or direct material, or whether you should include only suppliers from the country or suppliers from outside of the country. The recommendation from my side, it is based on my personal experience. In such situations, if you take certain limitations or certain conditions, you say, I am only covering direct materials in this year's reporting, but I am trying to cover my indirect materials in the next year's reporting. Or if you have data for both indirect and direct, you can bring out and report on that. If you have data engagement with your suppliers outside of the country, whom they can provide the data for you, then you can say that we can include that. But if you have difficulty this year, come out with that boundary condition very clearly in the disclosures, because if it is not mentioned in detail in the regulation, then we have to make some assumptions and then clearly mention that assumption in the report. Don't hide that report. If you are looking at even BRSR data last year which came, we compared various industries and various benchmarks. There is a huge variation between the companies, and that is because they have all put up a fine print. In my scope 1 and 2 emission, it is not 100% scope 1 and 2. I have omitted. I only selected 1, 2, 3 items. The balance things, I am preparing my data. Maybe next year I will report. And this this behavior is not only in India. It is actually happening. So if you are looking at the LSEG report which came out last week, in that also they have found variability in terms of the boundary definitions from across different entities. But the key point is when you come out with a disclosure, try to put in all the assumptions and all the limitations and all the boundary definitions in the report itself, so that somebody who's reading that, they will understand that disclosure. This is my recommendation, because it is still an evolving space, and unless SEBI is coming out with a more detailed guidance on it, I think from the response from the corporate should be, I'm taking an earnest effort to comply with the regulations, but these are my limitations, and that limitations I am actually openly disclosing. That should be acceptable to any of the stakeholders who are reading the report.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Joseph. I think even we are in ABB, in fact, we are also listed entity here, and the same approach, in fact, we have to cover, in fact, as much as possible, even wherever possible, we'll try to include in the scope. And of course, certain exclusion could be there that can be explained maybe this year. And of course, from the year, in fact, from where it's applicable to listed entity, in fact, right? I think that's the first one. And of course, Mr. Joseph, you also mentioned that the SBTI based, target setting has to be done. In fact, the way people have been doing across the world. But in India, like you also are aware that, many companies, either they just follow the corporate, maybe the corporate company, the headquarter might be outside the country. And, certain, in fact, Indian companies might not be having the maybe the kind of strategy where they have to get it confirmed by the SBTI and then only they can put certain targets. So what is your takeaway, like, taken on this matter that the point is SBTI so critical, or it is something that very important to have it before setting a target, or before, of course, going ahead with any sort of scope 1, 2, or 3 targets for any company? Because many of the companies also, we have seen even Amazon and many companies, in fact, we have also seen their response to the SBTI recently, right? So how the company, in fact, looks in that particular area, and is it so mandatory for us, in fact? Yeah.
So there are 2-3 considerations I think corporates should take. One is why you are coming out with a net zero ambition. What is the driver for you? Are you trying to come out with a reputation-based statement that I am also doing net zero, or do you think net zero ambitions and target setting will be critical for raising the funds which you are actually getting into? That is one dimension I think you should always think about. The second dimension is who are the investors for your company, and what is the expectation of the investors? That is the second thing which you need to look at. So some of the investors are having very clear SFDR requirements in European Union. It is reasonably you can expect that they will come out with more data related to your carbon emissions and disclosure. So depending on what kind of investors you are having, you can actually look at this problem of SBTI. The third angle is, if you take it very strategically, irrespective of whether you want to go for a compliance-driven approach or a investor-driven approach, you think that this is very core strategic to me, then it is always better to do an evaluation on SBTI. Whether you should commit to SBTI and all, that's a different thing, because coming out in public and commit to SBTI, that requires a lot of discussion internally. And you should also evaluate what is the pros and cons of doing that. Because once you commit to that, and if you're not achieving it, then that will be a kind of reputational issue which you have to face. So make sure that before you commit, you take a concerted effort and concerted discussion internally. But aligning with SBTI in terms of your using SBTI as a model, because it's all open models, which they are also bringing out. So evaluating your carbon emission trajectory with respect to that model will be always very much beneficial for you, because you will understand how the world is actually looking at your business and what kind of carbon reduction requirements are coming out globally, that you can understand. But I think the question is whether you should commit to it or not. That is something which needs to be taken from a more concerted discussion within the organization. But I find a value in terms of doing that analysis and then understanding what is the impact for you.
True. Thank you. In fact, quite detailed, explanation. In fact, thank you, Mr. Joseph. So we have one more query in the chat box. I think you have already explained that this is a voluntary part. Still, Mr. Dilip is asking, TCFD reporting, is it mandatory from RBI? I think you have mentioned there is a voluntary currently, right? And I think they are also voluntary in the sense they're looking at in the future that, slowly people, the companies or commercial, the entities must adopt it so that they can bring more transparency in this particular area, right? Right. Anything you would like to add? Yeah.
It's a kind of recommendation that RBI had brought in. So many of them started actually, because see, TCFD reporting, again, all this reporting also, you might have seen, the BRSR reporting. Many people have started doing the reporting much before, because doing an internal exercise on TCFD, and I think this is the case with most of the organizations globally, they would have done an internal assessment of TCFD and what is the kind of reporting requirement, how the data can be collected, who from the organization need to be involved in it, how to improve the capacity and capability of the people. Those things, even without any mandatory thing, you have to do, because I think that is where a very responsible organization who has more climate risk in the future needs to do it. RBI had recommended it for the regulated entities in the report. Last year RBI had come out with a report. RBI had recommended it, but it will come as a mandatory thing, I think, very soon, I believe.
Great. So I think we don't have any other questions in chat box. So I think we, of course, I request my participants also to approach BCIC, or maybe we can directly approach Mr. Joseph if you have any other queries. And I think with this, we'll conclude the session. I must say again, thanks to Mr. Joseph for very insightful and informative session, in fact, and the kind of presentation you had, it was really amazing. So thanks for that, and thanks for entire participants. Maybe over to Rupa Madam. Would you like to provide the vote of thanks for this?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Joseph, for such a wonderful and knowledgeable session. And actually, few of our members are asking for the for you to share the PPT. If it's feasible, if it's allowable, please do share it for us to share it to our members. And we look forward to have many more interactions, similar interactions in the future too. Thank you once again.
So thank
Definitely,
you
I
very
will
much.
share the deck with you, and then you can share it with the members also.
Sure, sure, sir. And thanks to all the participants for joining this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye. Take care. Have a great
Bye-bye.
day.